I'm Doris Schattschneider. I'm a professor emerita of mathematics at Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Can you tell me about your mathematical background?
Yes, my graduate work was at Yale and in algebraic groups. I wrote my dissertation in algebraic groups, and my first teaching job was at Northwestern University. My husband was at the University of Chicago working on a PhD, and there I was able to continue work in algebraic groups. There were people to talk to, there were seminars to go to at the University of Chicago, but when we left the University of Chicago, or Chicago in general, and came to Moravian College, I was hired by the college to teach in the math department. My husband went to the theological seminary where he taught church history. It was really impossible to continue in that field. It's a field where if you are working on a deep research problem, if you put it down, and typically you can't do a whole lot of research during the year at a liberal arts institution, the teaching load is pretty heavy. You can come back 6 months later and pick it up. It's going to take you almost a month to get back to where you were. So I had to give it up. But then I kind of fell into this whole area that's called discrete mathematics, and particularly tiling, tiling the plane, tiling surfaces, and that's what led me to Escher's work.
I'm a computer scientist, and of course, our field is completely dominated by discrete mathematics. And so for me, that's all there is discrete mathematics. But even so, there's continuous elements to tiling. There are families of tiles and so forth. Did you feel that there was still a bridge between your previous work and the new work?
Well, the one bridge, of course, was groups.
Yes.
In tiling, you talk about symmetry groups and particular subgroups of them and so on. So I was completely comfortable talking about groups, and in fact there's a particular kind of group that turns up in algebraic groups, that is reflection groups, and of course that too is part of discrete mathematics and related to tiling theory. So there was some overlap.
Well, I would go further and say a lot of people think group theory is a field of discrete mathematics. Is that too far?
Well, but there's continuous groups, Lie groups, discrete.
Yes.
There's a difference between finite or discrete groups and these continuous groups. And in tiling theory, you are dealing with definitely discrete.
Okay. Now, Escher was still alive when you were a math student, even though it wasn't your research area at the time. Were you even aware of his work at the time he was still alive?
I became aware of his work when I was in college. This is when he was becoming quite popular. So they would sell posters every spring in one of the college buildings so that you could put up Escher posters in your dorm room, that sort of thing. But the serious interest in his tessellations, how did he make these? How did he find them? What was the geometry or the mathematics that governed these, or even was there? I didn't know any of that, and that's what I ultimately ended up really researching in great depth.
Now, who were the major mathematicians working on tiling when you started?
Branko Grunbaum is the most important name, and he ultimately became my mentor. At the time I started teaching a course, I kind of invented a course for art majors that would connect mathematics and art. I titled the course The Mathematics of Decorative Design and Art. And I had to teach myself and then in turn teach the students. I had to write up my own notes. There was really nothing they could read that wasn't extremely technical. But the whole idea of learning about isometries, how they interact, how they govern what we call periodic patterns, that is those that repeat by translation or sliding in two different directions. I had to learn all that and then impart it to my students. And fairly soon, I can't really quite remember how I encountered Branko, but I was working on incorporating some Escher designs onto surfaces that had a periodic pattern as a grid, and I remember showing him some of this work I was doing, and from that point on he was very interested in what I was doing, but even better for me, he was working on tiling problems and working on various research papers that ultimately ended up in what has become kind of the Bible of tiling theory, namely a book called Tilings and Patterns. And we corresponded. He would send me preprints of his chapters as he was writing them. I would vet them or say I didn't understand or that this problem was wrong or whatever. So I would say Branko Grunbaum was the biggest influence and certainly the most well-known at that time.
But you started your notes before you met him, or?
Yes, I did.
So have your notes been published?
No, no. This was strictly for classroom of students who simply wanted to learn more about what underlay repeating designs and then obviously Escher-like tessellations and so on.
Well, Escher is known to the public, but perhaps even better known to the public are the tessellations from the Arabic world, even if they didn't know that's where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
The Arabic tessellations were fairly sophisticated, and I guess the rumor is they did that because they couldn't exercise other artistic avenues. How advanced really were they? I know they're beautiful to look at, but mathematically, how advanced were the earlier work?
Well, many people have asked that question, and one of the, I guess, problems I have is that mathematicians, or many mathematicians, have asked from today's point of view, from a mathematical point of view, how many different symmetry groups are represented in Arabic or Islamic tilings, that kind of thing. They weren't doing anything having to do with symmetry groups, or at least thinking about it that way. It was a way of putting pieces together to make beautiful patterns, and they produced pattern books. And so this was a craft. You can often find in their patterns mathematical mistakes because, as you know, when things get copied and copied and copied, mistakes creep in, or craftsmen might not be quite as careful. But I think it was considered a beautiful craft, and there was artistic ingenuity, but to actually think about it mathematically, I really don't think that was the way it was done. They knew about using compasses, and a lot of the construction was done with compasses. So that mathematical part was there.
But other mathematical traditions through algorithms and arithmetic came from the Islamic world. So there is a feeling, presumably, that they had to be people with the mathematician's hat on. But you're saying the evidence isn't that the mathematicians in that group were the same as the artists.
I think, as I say, I call them craftsmen.
Yes.
I have no idea whether or not there was direct interaction between, quote, mathematicians and craftsmen. But there were certainly some very sophisticated designers involved. Maybe those who made the designs were not the people who actually did the tiling, the physical act of tiling.
Yes.
But there is certainly some very beautiful and sophisticated designs being made. How much of what we would superimpose on them today as mathematical analysis, how much of that was involved, I can't say, and I'm not sure anybody can.
But today the mathematicians are involved.
That's right.
So again, we'll come to Escher in a few minutes, but in your experience, have the mathematicians today contributed to the artistic efforts? Are we seeing tessellations today that the mathematicians are responsible for, that the public would view as beautiful?
Oh, definitely. There are many mathematicians/artists who have created some very interesting tessellations and using techniques that would you don't see in the Islamic world. For example, fractal tessellations or tessellations that come from working out certain algorithms which by hand would be impossible simply because of time that computers can do. And also some introducing some new elements, the whole idea of metamorphosis and so on, that starting with one tessellation and gradually turning it into another. All of those are things that mathematicians can and do.
Well, metamorphosis is a good way for us to get to Escher, because he was famous for that, having tessellations that, as you read them from left to right, changed their character. Was he a leading light in this technique?
I think, well, he's certainly an inspiration, and he left us some visual representations of how to do it. You can gradually metamorphose. You start with a certain grid and gradually change the edges until you've turned it into some kind of a creature that interlocks with others. He also used some tricks. One trick that it took me a long time to find out about, and it wasn't until someone actually showed me a photo of one of his little sketches in his long metamorphosis, which is 7 meters long. There is a point at which you have lizards that are based on a square grid. So checkerboard squares have changed into lizards. And then suddenly there's lizards that are interlocking with these, but they're based on a hexagonal grid. Mathematically, those two grids never mesh. And so how did Escher do it? And I actually have a photo of a scrap that he drew in careful pencil, where he shows in penciled outline exactly how the one kind of lizard interlocks with the other kind of lizard, and then you're allowed to then get to the hexagonal grid. So this was an artistic trick. It wasn't a mathematical metamorphosis.
I see. Speaking of his artistic skill of carving and doing woodcuts, it seems like that skill, which is legendary, wouldn't work for metamorphosis, because he would have to have so many different patterns. Were those also woodcuts, or?
Yes, those are all woodcuts. He made separate panels. It first started out with 4 panels, each a meter long, and I don't know, 8 inches high or so. And obviously took him a long time. And then he received a commission from the post office for a huge new post office that was being built in The Hague. And they wanted to have metamorphosis, but they wanted it, the length of this wall, I can't even tell you how long it was enormously long. And they wanted to put metamorphosis, a huge painting on some kind of canvas on this wall, but they wanted 3 more panels. So he then created 3 more panels, so this of his woodcut version, and then those had to be transformed onto these huge canvases that then were mounted on this post office wall.
I gather other craftsmen did the paintings, or was he involved in that as well?
He wasn't involved in the actual painting, no. I'm not exactly sure how they enlarged the woodcut versions to this enormous size, but somehow they were enlarged, and then they hired actual painters to paint it.
The medium of woodcut seems to be perhaps the slowest way to have your ideas come to fruition. Why did he persist in this form when he could have been more productive some other way?
I think he really loved the working with his hands, he also had a very good education and mentor from Samuel Yesurin de Mesquita, who was a master graphic artist at the Harlem School of Decorative Arts and Architecture, which is where he studied.
And did he learn woodcutting from him?
He learned woodcutting from him, and all the there are variations on woodcutting. If you do the end grain, you can make very, very fine detail, and for less fine detail, you use the regular grain. Also, there's wood engraving, which is again a very detailed, fine technique, and he learned other methods of graphic arts as well, lithograph, and some. I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but you completely cover your sheet with black and then carve out from the black. So it's kind of a reverse thing. Instead of putting black on paper, you put the, in terms of drawing on it, you smear the whole paper with black and then etch out from that. So he was a master at the various crafts of the various techniques of graphic arts, and I think he really felt things through his hands.
Yes.
And he wasn't for making lots and lots of prints. Otherwise, he would have had a print shop doing it.
Yes.
All of his woodcuts were done one at a time by him, literally rubbing. He rubbed them with a little ivory spoon.
I see.
And so I think the idea of his whole person was in each print, really. And there are no two prints exactly alike, like you might get from a printing press.
Now, we know he met Coxeter late in life, and before that, he was always an artist and craftsman, and we know that he must have had an intuitive knowledge of mathematics, otherwise he couldn't have done what he had done. Is it easy to discuss how his life changed when he met mathematicians?
Well, I think he was a bit puzzled by their interest in his work.
Okay.
He learned not like you'd learn in a classroom or from a textbook. And although he interacted with mathematicians and they learned about his work and even used his work, I think that he appreciated their interest, and he knew that, I think he knew on an intuitive level that he was using mathematics, and yet he, throughout his life, said he never understood mathematics. He couldn't do mathematics. He was a poor mathematics student. His interaction with Coxeter was rather interesting. He was asked by Dick de Bruyn if he would do an exhibit for the 1954 International Congress of Mathematicians, which was held in Amsterdam. And so there was an exhibit of his work at that, I guess it was at a museum, a nearby museum, but many, many mathematicians saw that exhibit, saw his work for the first time. Roger Penrose saw his work there for the first time, as did Coxeter. And so from that point on, many in the mathematical world knew about his work. And that's how Coxeter knew he'd done tessellations. And then Coxeter, when he wrote about symmetry, asked Usher, could I reproduce some of your work in my monograph on symmetry? And that's kind of what started things.
So Coxeter was more of an apologist than those other mathematicians that saw the work. They were intrigued, but they didn't run with it.
Penrose did.
Penrose did.
Penrose did. You know Escher's print relativity? I showed it last night. Penrose says he got the idea for the Penrose tribar from Escher's print relativity.
Ah.
And of course, then Penrose sent this idea. Penrose and his father actually published this in a psychology magazine in Britain, and Penrose sent it to Escher, and not too long after that, Escher produced Waterfall, which uses the Penrose Triangle. So it's really a cycle.
Very good. Now, since we're at the G4G, I should pursue the connection between Gardner and Usher. And that was Coxeter as the in-between in that
Yes.
situation. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And more importantly, can you tell us about Gardner's role in the public acclaim that Usher later got?
Gardner was very much at the center of that. Gardner had already been well known to Coxeter, and Coxeter had sent him the book that was about to be published, which was a geometry book, which was, for its time, the 1960s, very unusual. It had a whole chapter on symmetry. Coxeter had already been in touch and wanted to use one of Usher's tessellations as an illustration. So Gardner wrote to Usher and introduced himself and asked permission. And surprisingly, Usher said, "Oh, I already know you, but not as a writer for Scientific American, but as doing the annotated Alice that Coxeter had sent him." So there's this wonderful triangle of Gardner, Coxeter, and Usher. And so the first column was really about Coxeter's book. And so Usher was mentioned, and Usher's tessellation was published in the book and in Gardner's column. But in '66, Gardner wrote a column completely dedicated to Usher's work. And there were 9 reproductions in that article of Usher's work. And that's the article that really got Usher's work known to the American public. There had been a couple of earlier articles in Time and one other magazine, I've forgotten, perhaps Life, but that hadn't, had much influence. It was Gardner's column with these 9 reproductions that, in fact, Usher said, and I think I quoted it last night, that I have no peace, especially from the American audience.
He benefited financially because I assume that means that earlier he wasn't doing so well financially.
That's right.
So how was his fortunes changed by this?
His fortune, well, once he became known to the American public, there was a great demand for his work. The grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, Cornelius von Schack Roosevelt, became kind of a middleman. He was already a collector of Usher's work and a good friend to Usher. And Usher, up until the early '60s, was really just selling graphic works out of his house. He didn't have an agent, and he certainly didn't have an agent in America. And so Roosevelt became his informal agent, and then that ultimately turned it over to a gallery in Washington. And so Usher could say, "Get in touch with this gallery if you want some of my work."
By gallery, you mean the National Gallery or a private gallery?
No, this was a private gallery, Michelson, the Michelson Gallery, which was a private gallery, and they would then import Usher's work and sell it.
Is there a side market in things like his blocks, or is it only his prints that are on the market?
Well, his prints are fairly available on the market, but of course, they're limited.
Yes.
There are no more. There are, unfortunately, fakes, and you have to be very careful if you're going to buy what you think is a real Usher. The blocks exist in some museums and in private collections. I think they're all accounted for, but they're pretty scattered.
I see. Well, getting back to you and mathematics, has this affected you? You clearly have a melding of 2 worlds in your work. And your mathematics has greatly influenced your understanding of the artistic world. But professionally, as a mathematician, can you say if the artistic world has had an impact on you?
As a mathematician, I'm not sure. As a person, I still love art. I have my favorite artists. I love to go to museums. I don't personally know a whole lot of artists, but I know many who cross the worlds in terms of math and art because of what I've written, because of what I've taught. And I still get great joy from what I think is good art.
Well, everyone who's attended this understands that you're a great lecturer and ambassador for this intersection of the two. Mm-hmm. And we thank you for coming.
Thank you.